please press *1 on your touch-tone phone, and please be sure that your telephone is unmuted and clearly record your name when prompted so your question may be introduced. Today's conference is beginning momentarily, and our first speaker today is Mr. Patrick Shepard. Thank you, sir. You may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the Ethics Fundamentals series. My name is Patrick Shepard. Very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Kane-Piasecki. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Patrick.
So what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we're going to be talking about roles for supervisors in confidential financial disclosure in the system overall. So,
Okay.
we're going to be talking about the review of confidential financial disclosure forms, of course.
Right.
But I also want to talk a little bit about the role that supervisors can play also in designating 450 filers.
Okay.
So,
Good. This is very timely because we all know that we have the confidential financial disclosure season coming up. The filing deadline is next month. So this is very timely, and supervisors are going to be called upon to take part in this work very shortly. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to share just a few administrative announcements. We hope you all had a good holiday season and enjoyed the break from training that we took in December.
yes.
But we will be back in the next week to discuss with you some scenarios that you can use in your annual ethics training programs. So this is going to be 10 scenarios for a general audience that you can take from our deck and use in your deck immediately. We're also going to be sharing some best practices for delivering that training and approaches that you can use to make effective ethics training throughout the calendar year. This is going to be the first in a series of events we're going to hold to provide you with a number of tools that you can use in both your initial ethics orientation and annual ethics training programs. We'll be back the following Thursday on the 28th with our Deputy General Counsel, Seth Jaffe, for a presentation for employees of the Offices of Inspectors General. This will be a general presentation about how ethics documents and OGE can support Inspectors General in their ethics investigations. So if you're interested in learning more about the enforcement side of our equation, please do join us then. And you should be seeing announcements for both of these in the coming weeks. So Cheryl, should we get started?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, I know we took a hiatus from this in December. We had other things going on, and with the holidays, we knew that folks were going to be taking off. But I want to start by wishing everyone a happy new year. And I think one of the things I'm going to suggest is maybe that today's broadcast might inspire people to undertake a New Year's resolution. And by that I mean is, if you aren't currently engaging supervisors in various aspects of your ethics program, that I'm hoping that today's broadcast will encourage you to do so. I think that in some programs, supervisors are underutilized, and I think they're a very valuable resource for the ethics shop in a multitude of ways. And today is only going to be one example of how you can use the expertise and the authorities that your supervisors have to bring value added to your ethics program, and also to bring support to your ethics program.
Right, because the ethics program belongs to the entire organization.
Absolutely.
And supervisors should feel some responsibility for the participation of their offices and departments in the administration of the program, and also compliance with the rules.
Absolutely. So if we can pull up the slide deck,
Sure.
Patrick, I want to go ahead and sort of get us in there and get us started. As I said today, we're going to talk about roles for supervisors in confidential financial disclosure. And I think this is singularly well suited for supervisors for a whole host of reasons. But the primary reason is because, and we're going to be repeating this throughout the day today, that it's really important that everybody understand that confidential financial disclosure has really a singular purpose. And that singular purpose is to identify and prevent potential conflicts of interest and other ethics concerns that employees have. That is its only purpose. And when we're dealing with conflicts of interest, one of the key pieces of information that we need to do a conflicts analysis, and it's very often a piece that ethics officials struggle to ascertain, is the actual government matters that employees are going to be working on or engaged in that could create the opportunity for a conflict of interest.
Right, we need to know what our people are doing.
Exactly. And absent that information, you can't really do a conflicts analysis. So if that's the only purpose of confidential financial disclosure, and ethics officials are not the ones who are necessarily in possession of that information, who is better situated to provide that kind of support to this particular function
Then supervisors.
Then supervisors,
We
yeah.
certainly hope they know what their employees are up to.
If they don't know what their employees are up to, they've got bigger problems than simply whether or not there's a conflict of interest for their employees. So the first thing I wanted to sort of address here, we're going to deal with is the designation of filers, and I want to talk about which employees are required to file, and talk a little bit about why supervisors are useful in this identification piece, and also to kind of walk you all through the criteria that they should be considering and you should be considering. And I'm hoping we have some supervisors watching this today. When you're just trying to decide who are your employees who should be filing. Now the requirements for this are in the Code of Federal Regulations at 2634.904. And kind of in a nutshell, the group of people we're looking at here are anyone who's a GS 15 or equivalent and below. But what we're really looking at is for that group of grade level employees, what we're looking for are what kinds of responsibilities and duties do these employees have? And for those that have duties and responsibilities that affect non-federal entities, those are the folks who present the greatest risk for us in terms of conflicts of interest.
So we ask for reports from those people who are likely to be in situations where they could have a conflict of interest.
Exactly.
That seems very consonant with our objective of preventing conflicts of interest.
Exactly. And the interesting thing with the 450 filing, with the confidential filing, is unlike the public filing, where public filers are defined by statute, and so you really don't have discretion in deciding who is going to file. In the 450 system, OGE has given you that discretion at the agency level. You are the ones making determinations about which employees do you think have duties that are such that it would be advisable for them to file a 450. So in essence, what I think you're being asked to do is to do something of a risk assessment. You're being asked to say, who among our employees is most likely to be in a position where they could even have a conflict of interest? And, so which programs and operations do we need to protect from the likelihood of that sort of ethics dilemma?
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's a good point to make with supervisors. This is really an exercise in the organization managing risk for itself. We don't conduct the confidential financial disclosure system for the benefit of the ethics office. The ethics office conducts the confidential system for the benefit of the agency.
And I think that anyone who has been engaged in the 450 system understands that confidential financial disclosure generally, is administratively very involved. It's a very complex system. There's a lot of man hours or person hours that go into administering the confidential financial disclosure system. So most organizations can ill afford to be spending time and resources engaging in a paperwork exercise. So what we really try to encourage folks to do is to take these criteria that we have in 904 and take them fairly seriously. And we've just revamped a job aid that we created this job aid back in 2009, and we've given it a facelift, and we've updated it a little bit to take out some old dollar values and some old references that were in it. And we gave you a copy of that on the max.gov site. So I'm hoping everybody has had a chance to pull that down and take a look at it. And basically what we do here is give you a checklist. So this is a really handy dandy checklist that you could give to anybody that you would want to have use or be part of making a determination about 450 filers. And we really divide it down into several categories of things to consider. And there are three primary categories. One is the pay grade. I mean, obviously we have to make sure that employees are in the appropriate pay grade level, that they shouldn't otherwise be filing a public form, for example.
Right.
So we're looking at people who are, if they're on the general schedule, looking at GS 15 and below. If they're on some other sort of pay scale, then you're looking at dollar values like 120% of the basic pay for GS 15 step 1. So
first thing we have to do is make sure that these people shouldn't be filing the 278.
Right, exactly. So once you've determined that they don't have to file the 278, then they are eligible to file the OGE Form 450. That's kind of it in a nutshell. But then we really get into the guts of what we really want you to consider and where supervisors can really bring a lot to the table. Because the second piece is, what exactly is the type of work that the employee is doing? So here we're getting to the duties and responsibilities. So under 2, we're asking, okay, does the employee's work involve contracting or procurement. Those are kinds of the obvious duties and positions that would be eligible for 450 filing. The first bullet point, we talk about contracting or procurement above the micro purchase threshold. And I know that gets adjusted periodically. So whatever the current dollar value is for that. Now, what I want people to understand, though, is that's like not hard and fast. That's just like one consideration. So it could be if you have somebody who has a purchase card, but only very rarely uses it or is only periodically called upon to use it, you may decide, well, it's not a really significant responsibility they have, and their ability to purchase, their purchasing authority is fairly low, and they're pretty much just purchasing something somebody else has decided needs to be purchased. I mean, all of those factors go into whether or not somebody's really
merely executing the entry of the payment information, right? They're basically processing payments versus making selections about who we should purchase from. We don't really have any discretion.
Right, and discretion is exactly the word. But if you have some people who have enormous discretion and have a micro purchase have micro purchase authority, and that's their primary responsibility, well, then maybe you might want to have them file just to make certain that they're not even inadvertently violating a criminal statute, because we are talking about potentially a criminal statute here with the conflict of interest laws.
Right. So there's no exception in 208, the conflict of interest law, for micro purchases.
Right.
It's just that we find typically people who only have micro purchase authority sometimes don't have the authority or discretion to sort of make meaningful distinctions in that process.
Exactly. So again, it's a matter of balancing a whole lot of things. It's the magnitude of that duty, the magnitude of the responsibility and discretion they have, the frequency with which they engage in this activity. Those are all things that should be taken into consideration when you're deciding what risk level profile like this employee has for a potential conflict to make a decision about whether or not they should be filing a 450.
Right.
And then the other categories are administering or awarding grants, subsidies, licenses. I mean, these are all, I think, fairly self-evident. Regulating, auditing, or inspecting non-federal facilities. That, I think, is, again, where you can clearly directly affect the interests of non-federal entities.
Right.
And that's kind of the catch-all that comes at the end, is performing other activities when those activities will have a direct and substantial effect on the financial interests of non-federal entities. So we're really looking at anybody who has duties that can affect non-federal entities. Under number 3, we have some other categories of employees where we think that the nature of the work that they're doing is such that we want to make sure that they're free of any conflicts of interest. And that's our folks who are doing any investigating, any prosecutorial activities, engaging in any kind of litigation. And then our final bullet here, I think, is interesting, is for our scientific or social science research folks, when the research could have a direct and substantial effect on the financial interests of non-federal entities. So I think this is a nice one to alert us to, because I think when we think about non-federal entities being affected, I think we too often suffer from the blindness of thinking that we're only talking about like for-profit entities like corporations or general partnerships, or things that have a for-profit aspect to them.
But we could also be talking about nonprofits, educational institutions, all those kinds of things as well.
Absolutely. You can talk about universities. Universities receive grants and have, all sorts of, like CRADAs and things like that. So, so we're not just dealing exclusively with with entities who can be affected. Don't have to be just for-profit corporate type of entities. So for the next is, the next question sort of gets to whether or not the employee only engages pretty much in ministerial or administrative matters. Because if you have someone whose duties are really more administrative, again, where they're not making decisions, substantive decisions, or exercising discretion, but are just kind of following through on
the administrative steps. So they're not making substantive recommendations, but maybe they're doing administrative work like, I don't know, helping to schedule events or, format agendas, administrative work that doesn't go to the substance of the matters that we're looking at.
Exactly. Those folks really don't have a lot of discretion. The prospect of them for a conflict is mitigated. The risk factor for them is mitigated. And so they might not be necessary to have them file. And when I'm saying all these things, I'm saying this with a view to, just because somebody has a certain grade level The grade level alone is never a trigger for filing. So just because someone is a GS-15 doesn't mean they should be filing a financial disclosure report. If they're a GS-15 and they have duties that meet these criteria, then yes, they reasonably should be expected to file a 450. But the grade level alone is not dispositive. You have to look at what the actual duties of the position are. And again, supervisors are in a much better position to inform that decision making, because they know exactly how much responsibility and the nature and type of duties that any of their employees perform. And then if we go to the third level here, this gets into sort of yet another level of discretion, which is how much responsibility does the employee actually exercise? So we're looking at whether or not the employee actually has decision-making authority. Do they actually make approvals? Do they make substantive recommendations? Are they conducting investigations or rendering advice and opinions? You know, or are they actively supervising other folks who do those things? So those are all things that are reaching to the part of the conflict of interest statute that talks about personal and substantial participation.
I think of these as, you know, asking, does the contribution of this employee get to the substance of the government's decision-making process?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Are they influential on the final disposition of whatever is going to happen? You know, do they have input into that process? Vice merely being sort of ministerial and you know, providing sort of administrative support.
Right, and the critical thing here is I want everybody to understand that doesn't mean that you only want the employees who are final decision makers, because you can be a non-supervisory, non-decision making type of employee and have very substantial input into the matters that are coming before your agency. So I don't want anybody to walk away from this saying, oh, well, then we only need the people who are making the final decisions. That's not the case. Right. It's people who are substantively involved in the you know, the material aspects of the matters that your agency is dealing with. And then at number 6, we're looking at whether or not the degree of supervisory review that someone has. And this one I'd like people to be a little bit careful with too, because I think what we're really trying to get at here is, you know, how much discretion does a person have? Does an authority to, you know, exercise discretion does a person have? Because just because you're supervised or just because somebody's going to be reviewing your work doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't have conflicts of interest.
That's right.
But again, here, this is just another material consideration to factor into all of the other stuff that we talked about as to whether or not you think someone presents enough of a risk profile for a potential conflict that they should be filing an OGE Form 450.
And I think this is a challenge for agencies because it's really, it's in part a resource question. You know, we don't want to be over-inclusive because we will never finish with our 450 reviews. So we don't want to review reports from people who shouldn't be filing them. But we also don't want to be under-inclusive because, you know, in that case, you have people falling through the cracks who may be at risk and not have the benefit of financial disclosure review to help keep them out of trouble. Mm-hmm. So the reason we provide agencies the discretion is so that they can get it as close to right as possible. Mm-hmm. And we would encourage you to use these criteria to be as precise as you possibly can be. And supervisors play an important role in that process.
I think one of the other reasons to engage supervisors in this, even if you don't have them have a formal role in it, to have them informally at least understand the criteria for filing. And that's because people can move in and out of filing positions all the time. And we have that happen here even at OGE, where maybe someone doesn't one particular year have certain duties that would necessarily require them to file a 450, but then the next year or in a certain quarter, they actually are engaging in a fairly substantive activity that really probably we should get a 450 from them just to make sure that they're conflict free. So, you know, and that's the hard piece is making sure that you're kind of actively getting at the people you need to get at. And so I guess that's all I'm suggesting is that if supervisors are aware of what qualifies someone as a 450 filer, and they feel like they have some responsibility for monitoring that, they're the ones who are giving people assignments. They're the ones who would know if they've got somebody who should be considered to be a 450 filer, even if it's just for a particular filing year.
Yeah. And actually, when I was working in an agency, a practice that we undertook every year was to share the list of filers in a supervisor's office with the supervisor, along with the criteria, and ask them, did we get it right? Are these still the right people? And it was very interesting from year to year what you'd find. It'd say, oh, this person took over that program, so they should probably file. This program fell out of that person's purview, so I'm not sure we need a report from them. So, you can actually save yourself a lot of time and find that you get the right people this way.
And that's what I do here actually at OGE is every year I send the supervisors a list of the current filers, and I ask them to let me know if anybody should come off the list or if anybody should come on the list, and then a rationalization for why or a justification for why they should be added or subtracted. And you at the very least you get a conversation going with the supervisors about who's filing and why. So
I would caution people just a little bit here to be sure that you're supporting supervisors in the ability to decide that someone should not file.
Right.
Some supervisors get very nervous and they say, I'm concerned that my list is going to be under-inclusive, so I'm just going to have everyone file. And that's not good for the filers who are unnecessarily disclosing. It's not good for us as reviewers because we're spending time reviewing reports that don't need to be reviewed. But in order for supervisors to help us effectively, we need to be willing to help them make those determinations. So an offer we had is, if you think someone's close to the line, you want to talk about it, the ethics office is here to talk to you, and we'll make this decision together.
Right.
If you're not absolutely certain. And that provided some comfort that, you're not out on your own, and, there aren't going to be consequences if you sort of draw the line in the wrong place. We said, we're willing to help you and share responsibility for that decision.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly it, is that it is a shared responsibility. And I don't think the ethics office should ever feel as though it's hanging out there, on its own without support for whatever determination you make in terms of the people that you're including or the people that you're excluding from filing. I mean, I think it's you're supporting the mission of the agency, and you're supporting the integrity of the programs of the agency, and that's everybody's responsibility, not just the ethics office's responsibility. So hopefully we've persuaded you that this is, if you're a supervisor, we've persuaded you that this is a role that you should legitimately undertake. And if you're just an ethics official who's looking for ways to engage supervisors, hopefully we've given you some fodder to help encourage folks to become involved. In terms of the confidential financial disclosure forms, as we're all aware, the primary form that if we were to have, well, I guess I'm segueing into having supervisors assist with the review of the 450. We've talked about their role in designating filers, and now I want to move to their role, their critical role in supporting the review of OGE Form 450s, confidential financial disclosure forms. And they can assist in any of the forms that are used, and these are the variety of forms that an employee could ostensibly be filing. I want to take one moment to talk a little bit or remind everybody about, when we engage in a review of the 450, whether it's the ethics office alone or the ethics office with supervisory intermediate review or just with some sort of support, at the end of the day, we have to be able to certify that the filer is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. And it seems to me that to the extent that that requires information that only certain individuals are in possession of, then those individuals should in some way be enlisted to provide that kind of information so that this certification statement can truly and honestly be attested to.
Right. And it's okay if that happens through a combination of individuals' knowledge and understanding.
Right.
Right. Oftentimes, in order to get to certification, we're going to need information both from supervisors and from an ethics official.
Right.
And that's exactly the point. Is we want to work together to get to the point where we're able to certify the report.
And what I want to suggest to you today again too is, I know on the certification page with the signatures, it's sort of an indication that it contemplates a supervisor having a very formal role, which is, reviewing the form in some formal way, signing and dating the form, as an intermediate reviewer. So having a very formal role in this process. And I think that's a very legitimate thing to have supervisors do. And I think it's great if agencies are actually doing that. But what I would like to suggest to you all too is that you don't necessarily have to have the supervisor's role be quite that formal, that maybe there's merit to enlisting supervisors to assist you without necessarily requiring them to be sort of a certifying official on the report itself.
And sort of a consultative role.
Right.
I've heard of agencies, or small parts of agencies, small offices, where sometimes the ethics official will sit down with the 3 or 4 supervisors, and they'll sit down, and in case there are questions, sort of talk about the issues that as they arise. And they're not a certifying official, they're not in the procedures, but they're a resource to provide information to the certifying official.
Exactly. And the reason I say that is because what I'm going to be talking about from here on out is the certification process. And we're going to walk through the legal authorities that folks need to be somewhat familiar with in order to be able to assist in the review of a 450. And I just think the more formal those folks' roles are, the more daunting it may seem to them in terms of what their responsibilities are. And that we shouldn't have, the process drive people's participation or lack thereof. And I think to the extent that you can enlist supervisory participation, even on an informal basis, is a very worthy thing. So I just don't want anybody to be frightened by the process that we're going to walk you all through.
Right. At the end of the day, we need the legal expertise, the substantive expertise, to come together in a way that can get us to certification.
Right.
And however an agency elects to do that is good, as long as it's done.
Yeah, and I think it's reassuring supervisors that by engaging in this process, they're not becoming ethics officials, and you're not expecting them to be an ethics official. But what you are asking them to do is to bring their expertise and understanding, and to take some responsibility, frankly, for their role as a supervisor in assigning duties to their employees, and making sure that those things are free of conflicts of interest. So the certification process is pretty much goes this way. I mean, for 450 review, for the confidential financial disclosure review, we really are primarily concerned with a conflict of interest analysis. So we always say the conflict of interest analysis really has to come first. Now, of course, there's a technical review that always kind of has to be supportive of that conflicts analysis.
We have to get the information we need to determine if something poses a conflict.
Exactly.
So that's the technical reporting. Is it technically sufficient? I don't know. Can I make a conflicts determination? That's the question we have to answer.
Exactly, because if you don't have enough information to be able to identify what's on the form, then you certainly can't do a conflicts analysis on it. So when we talk about a technical review, we don't diminish the technical review, because we realize that you have to have enough information to be able to do a reasonable conflicts analysis. It's just, we say it's subordinate because you can have a technically perfectly reported set of assets on a report, but if you don't know enough to know what of all of those beautifully reported assets could present a conflict, well, you've kind of defeated the entire purpose of the exercise.
We just filled out the form for the sake of it.
We beautifully filled out a form, and we didn't serve its purpose. We do suggest that even for supervisors who are reviewing forms, that they have some sensibility about what remedies are required, particularly if they identify the real prospect for a conflict, because as we all know, if they do find the potential for an actual conflict of interest under the criminal statutes, the employee is going to have to immediately disqualify themselves if it's a matter that they're currently working on. So we do want supervisors to be somewhat familiar with remedies so that they know, disqualification is required, so they have some familiarity with the exemptions in 2640, so that they can, not have a false alarm in certain instances. So remedies is something with which we do need to seek that in order to be able to sign the report, particularly if we identify an actual or potential conflict of interest. The supervisors will obviously, if you're enlisting their assistance, supervisors have to know that there's a 60-day window for certification. And that's from the day that the agency receives the report. You've got a 60-day window in which to certify the report. Now, obviously, that 60 days gets told if you are seeking additional information or are still trying to work through some issues with a filer. But just so that everybody understands, the more people you have involved in that process, the 60 days can toll pretty quickly.
Yes.
These are Privacy Act protected forms, so no matter where they are in the review chain, once they hit somebody's office for review, they do have to be kept under lock and key. So we always like to remind folks of that these things can't be just allowed to lie about, irrespective of what your role is in that review process or where you are in that review process. And then these forms get retained for 6 years. So the legal basis for the review, which we're going to walk through here briefly to kind of the 64,000 foot level, we're not going to get down in the weeds in this. We just want to give supervisors sort of enough of an understanding of these legal authorities so that they can do some issue spotting and flag things that they think could really be a problem. We don't expect supervisors to be legal scholars. We do not expect supervisors, as I said before, to be ethics officials. But we can arm them with enough understanding of the legal issues that are involved so that they can do meaningful issue spotting for us. So we'll be talking about the criminal conflict of interest statutes, the financial disclosure regulations to a certain extent so that they know what to expect to see on the form and what they don't necessarily expect to see. The standards of conduct regulations at 2635, there's certain provisions in there. And then obviously they would have to be knowledgeable of any agency requirements that you all would have, like any prohibited holdings restrictions or prior approval for outside activities or anything that is unique to your agency. As we said, the things that we would want supervisors to have at least some basic knowledge of are the applicable statutes, regs, and the form itself. What they bring to the table, though, is the filer's position and duties. That's really where we're asking them to bring their expertise. And we put in spouse and children in here, and really that would know we don't expect them to have intimate knowledge of somebody's spouse and children. I think what we're referring to here is just having knowledge that the employee has a spouse and children. So to be looking for those things on the form.
Yes, because those are reportable, right? If you see an absence of those things, especially the first time, you want to ask about that. When we get new entrant reports here at OGE, that's one of the first questions is, do you have a spouse?
Right.
Because if you do, we need that person's assets to be disclosed so that we can perform a conflicts analysis. And it's something people often forget or don't realize is reportable. It's a common error.
Mm-hmm. And then, again, some knowledge of what the appropriate remedies are if they do flag anything on a report. So the conflict of interest statutes, there are various of them. The one we're going to focus on today, that is the primary one that we would seek supervisory assistance with, is 18 U.S.C. Section 208. And this is one which basically says an employee can't participate. And this is why disqualification becomes the remedy if you do identify something. Employees are prohibited from participating personally and substantially in a particular government matter, if that matter would have a direct and predictable effect on the employee's own financial interest or financial interests that are imputed to him. And we're going to talk in a minute about the imputed interests that you're most likely going to encounter on a 450. But so bottom line is, if an employee is assigned to a matter and they've got a financial interest that could be affected by that matter, they have to immediately be disqualified from that matter.
Exactly.
In addition, there are some exemptions from the conflict of interest statutes. Those are housed in the regulations at 2640. It's not necessary that supervisors necessarily know where they're housed. It's just giving supervisors enough of a familiarity with the exemptions. So again, that they can know when they have an immediate problem and when they may need a little bit more information to know whether or not what they're seeing on the form is actually a problem. So we're going to talk a little bit about 208 and like the analysis that we want supervisors to bring to the table and to bring this down to a level where it's not a rigorous legal analysis, but it's an issue spotting, flagging potential conflicts of interest.
You cast a wide net and then we let the ethics officials sort of winnow the catch.
Yes, exactly. So it's important to understand that for purposes of 208, we only have a conflict of interest where there's a government matter. You can't have a conflict of interest absent a government matter. So the critical piece of information that we want supervisors to bring to the table when they start looking at someone's 450, the first thing they have to think about is, what are the things that this business unit is going to be working on? And most particularly, what are the things that this individual employee is currently working on? And what is it that they're likely to be working on?
Right.
Okay. That's the piece of information they have to have in their head before they start looking at the confidential financial disclosure form. Because the second piece that you need to do a 208 analysis is the piece that the employee is bringing to the table on their 450, which is their financial holdings and other interests that they have that are required to be filed on the form. So what a supervisor is going to be looking for purposes of spotting a conflict is, are any of the matters the employee is currently working on or may likely be working on or that may be coming before the business unit over the next year or whatever, are any of those matters likely to come up against, bump up against, have an effect on or involve any of the identified entities that are disclosed on that employee's 450. So it's a nexus test. We're looking for a connection between those two pieces. So what we're asking the supervisors to identify are these what we call particular government matters. And I don't think it's necessary that supervisors have a huge command of the nomenclature. It's more important that they understand conceptually what that nomenclature means.
Yes.
So particular government matter, a particular matter for purposes of 208. These are the kinds of government matters that can create a conflict of interest. We're not concerned about this big circle, which we are calling matters. And by that, we mean they're typically going to be very broad, very general matters that affect a very large and diverse group of people or entities.
Right.
So if you have something that, for example, would affect every company in the United States, I think that would probably be something that was a matter and it wouldn't be covered under 208 because it would be so broad and so general and would affect literally everything that's called a company in the United States.
Yep. As a reviewer in an agency, I think, if I had a choice, I'd prefer my supervisors to understand this concept over-inclusively versus
Right.
under-inclusively. So the point when I'm talking to supervisors that I make here is that we mean more than just the smallest gray circle, right? Regulations and policy things can be particular matters, but not all regulations and policies are particular matters.
Yes. So there's this very broad group are the things that don't fall within the definition of particular government matter, which means many, if not most of the things that people work on are particular government matters, because what we're dealing with in that next smallest circle are particular matters which we say are focused on a discrete and identifiable class of persons. By that, we simply mean that there are going to be a variety of people who are equally affected by it. So we have things like regulations, policies, programs. So if you have a grant program that is delineating who can be eligible to apply for a grant, that grant program is a particular government matter, even though it equally affects similarly situated people, but we can identify who those similarly situated people are. So if you've got a regulatory thing that's coming up, if you've got a policy prescription that you're going to be working on, if you've got any kind of a program that's being implemented, that gets implemented on a regular basis, and you're making determinations about that program, even at the programmatic level, decisions and determinations are going to involve a particular matter.
And I find this is a point that I like to really drive home with supervisors, is that just because a policy or regulation would affect all of the companies that your office deals with does not make it a matter rather than a particular matter. If you work in the Office of Helicopter Regulations and you pass a regulation affecting all helicopter manufacturers, the fact that that affects everyone that you do business with doesn't make it suddenly a broad matter. It's a particular matter because the discrete and identifiable class are helicopter manufacturers.
Right.
And they certainly are. And even though that might feel like the whole universe to the people who write helicopter regulations, when we're looking at the law, they're definitely a discrete and identifiable class.
Yes, they are a subset of some much larger group. And so once you start getting into subsets of bigger groups, I mean, again, as Patrick said, just because that's the universe, like that's the entirety of your universe, doesn't mean that that's a broad class of individuals. That is a discrete and identifiable class of individuals. And so anything that affects them, I mean, a matter that's going to affect them discretely is going to be a particular matter for purposes of 208.
And I think for ethics officials, when we're approaching regulatory offices particularly, we can help them by sort of suggesting that the work they do they are all particular matters, right? If I'm approaching the Office of Helicopter Regulations, I'm going to tell them, look, helicopter regulations are particular matters, right? I already know that's what you do, so I can inform you of that. And likewise, if you're a supervisor and you're not sure if your work constitutes a particular matter, ask an ethics official to help you determine whether or not that's the case, because it's a hard decision to make.
Right, it is. So, and then when we get to the smallest circle, I think those tend to be the matters that are most easily identifiable for folks, and it's the ones that most readily come to mind. And these are the particular matters that are focused on specific parties. So anytime you have a named party, so things like if you're working on a contract, if you're working on a grant, if you're doing an investigation, if you're doing an inspection, if you're doing an audit of a particular entity, anything where you're clearly dealing with a discrete and specifically named party, those are clearly government matters and also need to be, vetted for potential conflicts of interest. But again, I don't think it's absolutely necessary for supervisors to be able to use the language, provided that conceptually they understand that government matters are broad, and government matters include things like regulations and policies and programs, and are not just relegated to this smaller group of specific party matters. So we mentioned earlier that you need to, if supervisors are aware that the employee has a spouse or minor child, that's useful information, not only because that information is required to be disclosed on the report itself, the 450, but also for purposes of the criminal statute. The spouse's financial interests and the minor child's financial interests are both treated as if they were identical with the employees. So when we're doing a review of the 450, we have to be as mindful of what the spouse holds as we are of what the filer holds. Another imputed interest that you need to pay special mind to when you're reviewing the 450 is this organizational interest. And this one is not intuitively obvious, I don't think, to people. And so if you have an employee who is actively engaged in an outside organization, and in that they're serving as an officer of that organization, or they're on the board of directors, or they're a trustee or a general partner, or if they just have outside employment with that entity, that entire entity's financial interest is treated as if it were the employee's own. So you have an organizational imputation of financial interest. So that means any matter that employee is working on that could affect that organization, period, is going to be a conflict for them because they have this imputed financial interest.
So if I were on the board of a company, on a board of directors, serving as a director, for the purpose of the law, it's as if I was the sole owner of the company. Yes. Okay.
Yes. It treats you as if you are one and same as the company. So when you're looking at particularly like the outside activities, or if you see that the employee has earned income from an outside source, you're going to want to take a special look at that organization and make sure it's not one that has business before your agency, that is a prohibited source for your agency, or that somehow the employee would be assigned matters that could affect or involve that organization. So your analysis process is effectively this. You're gonna say, okay, what types of matters is this employee actually participating in, or might this employee participate in? So you get that in your head first. What sorts of things does this employee work on? And then as you're looking at each asset on the 450, you think to yourself, okay, is there anything here that jumps out at me that seems to be related to the work that this employee is doing, or even the work that this business unit is doing? Because you need to flag any potentials for conflict, as well as anything that is currently an actual conflict. You can consider whether or not a 2640 exemption might apply. I don't want to be too heavy about this piece, because I think the supervisor's biggest role is to flag stuff for the ethics office. The ethics office is responsible for having a full understanding of all of the remedies, so they know what to discount and what not to discount. But I just wanted to cover just a couple of them here. Mostly so you understand there may be some things that you're not seeing on the form that you're wondering why you're not seeing it on the form. And one of them are like diversified mutual funds. Diversified mutual funds are are not required to be reported on the 450, and it's because they have been exempted from the 208 conflict of interest provisions.
Yeah, and I remember back in 2007 when we revised the 450,
Mm-hmm.
not to require the reporting of diversified mutual funds. The reason we did that is ethics officials were telling us they spent a lot of time getting the full names of obviously diversified mutual funds,
Mm-hmm.
and that it was an administrative headache with no purpose. And we said, great, we'll just make them not reportable. And now ethics officials tell us that they spend a lot of time going back to filers asking them to take diversified mutual funds off of the form.
Mm-hmm.
We tell them that you don't have to do that. It's a confidential report. If you see a diversified mutual fund, you can just ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
You can maybe make a reminder next filing season that, if you don't want to report them, they don't have to go on the form. But we weren't trying to make work for you going back and forth, taking diversified funds off of the reports.
Right. So they don't have to take it off if it's there. But just so that you're kind of alerted to that, so that A, if you do see them, they're not a problem.
Right.
And B, if you don't see them, you're not worried that the person is materially failing to disclose what they're supposed to disclose on the form.
Right.
Now, the other kind of mutual funds, sector mutual funds, those do have to be reported because those do have the potential for conflict. We haven't exempted all sector mutual funds. What we have done, though, is we've created a de minimis a value for what is not considered to be a conflict. So people can have up to $50,000 in sector funds that could potentially conflict, and it's not considered a conflict of interest. And again, I think if you see a sector fund that you think is a potential conflict as a supervisor, you flag it.
Absolutely.
Let the ethics shop take care of following up with the filer to find out whether or not.
But for peace of mind, you might not need to get too upset because there's a likelihood that the exemption might apply.
The exemption might apply. And, and again, if it's something that you think, but if it's something though that you think is an immediate concern, like it's involving something that the employee is currently working on, then the best course of action is to have the employee disqualify unless or until you can ascertain that the exemption actually applies. Because if the exemption doesn't apply and they continue working on a matter and that sector fund creates a conflict for them, well, now they've just violated a criminal statute. So we don't want that either. But best if you spot anything, flag it, get to the ethics office immediately, and then make a determination about whether or not an exemption applies. The other set of exemptions, just to give you a sensibility about it, are for securities. These would be for like stocks, corporate stocks or corporate bonds. And again, if you flag something on a report, it looks like a stock holding, it's with a company that you think presents a conflict or an appearance of a conflict, still go ahead and flag it, understanding that, again, it may very well be something that, depending upon how much of it the employee owns,
right,
it may not be a problem and the exemption may take care of it.
But again, I think your advice is good. Where you see these things, especially if it's a current problem, ask the employee to stop participating until you can determine that the exemption applies.
Exactly. So that the criminal statutes, and that's not to say that's the only criminal statute that applies, but that's the primary one where supervisors can be of tremendous assistance.
That's where we need the most help from supervisors in making the determination.
Exactly. The next provision is the impartiality provisions of the standards of conduct. This again is another place where supervisors can be extremely helpful. But I don't want to go into all of what constitutes a covered relationship for purposes of 502, because I think at the end of the day, what we want supervisors to do for purposes of 502 is kind of the same thing we're asking you to do for purposes of 208, is to look at anything that's listed on the form, and to the extent that you flag anything, you flag an entity, you flag an organization that you think is one that either could be affected by the work of your business unit or could be involved in matters in your business unit or comes before your business unit. Really, that's all you have to do is flag it. And again, alert the ethics office. The ethics office can then make the determination about whether or not it's a 208 relationship, whether or not it's a 502 relationship. The supervisor's value added is simply in acknowledging or recognizing which of the listed entities on the form
might have business before their office.
Might have business before their office.
Or otherwise be affected by their work.
Exactly. So that then the ethics office can be making that 502 determination. And then finally, I think another place where supervisors can bring value added to the review is in outside activities. And here it's, I think, a couple of things. Number one, for agencies who have prior approval requirements, I mean, clearly the ethics shop can flag these too. So this isn't something that this specifically that a supervisor can do that an ethics official can't. But I think with there being prior approval, I would imagine that there are times when the ethics shop gets the information well before the supervisor does, if the supervisor is ever necessarily informed of
the prior approval process.
Of the prior approval process. Now, I don't know, maybe many agencies require supervisory sign-off as part of the prior approval. And if you do, then what I'm about to say is really kind of moot. But I do think that there's value in having a supervisor weigh in, particularly if there's any indication that the outside activity in any way relates to the employee's duties, either subject matter wise or the entity they're going to be doing the outside activity with is one that's a prohibited source for the agency. But certainly if the supervisor is reviewing the forms, they can certainly be flagging things like outside activities and querying about whether or not there was prior approval. Right. That's certainly something they can do. And also flagging an outside activity that they think might in any way be related to the employee's duties. And that's the bigger piece that supervisors can bring to the table. So that was kind of our 64,000 foot treatment of like more or less what we think a supervisor needs to understand or basic understanding to bring to the table to be able to do a supervisory review. So Patrick and I thought what would be helpful at this point would be to kind of do a mock review of an OGE Form 450 to give you a better, more specific sensibility about applying all that stuff we just talked about.
Yeah, how do you actually do this stuff?
Right.
Give you an example of the actual process that you would go through as a supervisor looking at a report. Exactly.
Now we manufactured an agency just so that we're all sort of coming at it with the same level or lack of understanding, I guess.
Yes.
And our agency profile it's the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission, which is not an actual government agency.
It is not.
And what do? They regulate nuclear energy producers. Yes. Okay, so that's what we do. That's our job. That's our agency. We regulate nuclear energy producers. So the next piece of information that we're going to look at, and this is what we would ask supervisors to bring to the table. This is what they need to know. They need to know, okay, this is my employee. My employee is James Nikolic. He's a GS-15 program manager, and he manages a team of inspectors and experts who make recommendations specifically related to the regulation of nuclear energy producers and that more broadly affect the energy sector, okay? So he's involved in inspections. He oversees inspectors and experts. He's also involved in regulatory matters, and those regulatory matters evidently not only affect nuclear energy producers, but can also have a splashover effect, I guess, on the energy sector
as a whole.
As a whole. Okay. So with that, armed with that knowledge of our agency and the employee, let's take a look at the form that they filed. Now, contrary to what that said about his hiring date was, we're treating this as a new employee. We're treating this as a new entrant. So one of the first things that you'll want to look at when you get these reports, and this is whether you're an ethics official or a supervisor, is what is the nature of the report? Because the nature of the report, whether it's a new entrant report or an annual report, is certainly going to affect, it's certainly going to have an effect on what you're going to see on the report in it, or it should have an effect on what you see on the report. So in this instance, we know we have a new entrant. This is somebody who's at least new to the position, if not new to government.
Right.
Okay. The other thing we want to focus on is the date that we received the report, and I'm circling it up here in the corner because I said before that's the date that's going to trigger your 60-day certification requirement. So you're going to want to keep your eyes on, okay, when did we get this, and how soon do I need to sort of hop on this?
Well, I think this is important for whoever is doing the collecting of the report to know that they should be indicating the date received by the agency. So, whoever your agency decides the employee should give the report to is responsible for inputting that date.
Mm-hmm. And then just kind of generally, once you get to the step 2 of this form, there are these yes/no blocks, and that's supposed to be the filer indicating whether or not they have any assets to report on the form. So you can do a real quick look and make sure that wherever they've checked yes, they actually have something reported there, and wherever they've checked no, that there isn't anything there. But that's just kind of your quick and dirty, is there anything here that we have to take a look at?
And for filers with nothing to report, the report could be very short,
right.
And you don't have to keep those blank pages. You can just keep the cover page with all the no's checked.
Exactly, and sign off on it, and you're good. You're good to go. But our filer does have stuff to report and has quite a bit to report, actually. So it's actually got 2 pages. So if we look here, we've got 5 different holdings here. And if we look at the next page, we've got 5 additional holdings there. So they've got a decent amount of stuff for us to ferret through. So Patrick, if we were to give our supervisors kind of a quick and dirty, what is it that you should be doing with this report, and how should you approach this report, armed with an understanding of what the employee does and is likely to do?
Right.
What should be your course of action?
So the way that I think is the easiest way to think about going through the review of one of these reports is to look at each entry one at a time and ask yourself if you can determine either that this is an entity that will be affected by our work and therefore poses a potential problem, or this is an entity or organization that will never be affected by our work, so definitely will not pose a problem, or I don't have enough information to make that determination one way or the other, so I need more information. So I think this is how the technical review supports the conflicts review. The question I'm asking is, can I say that this definitely poses a potential conflict, definitely will not pose a potential conflict, or I don't have enough information to determine either way? And if it's that third category, then we know we need to get more information, and I'm either going to work with the ethics official to get it or work directly with the employee.
Exactly. So with that kind of a methodology in mind, we're going to go through, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to look at each entry, and we're going to talk about whether or not we think it's something we can flag based on what we know about what the employee does, whether or not it's something we can say, not a problem, we can move on, or whether or not it's something where we're like, I'm not really sure, I don't have enough information. And then we can talk a little bit about what additional information do you need, and what that review would look like, and a little bit about procedurally, how you might want to go about doing that. So let's start with the first one, Patrick. We've got big private energy company.
Okay. So given that we work for the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission, and we know that Mr. Nikolich's duties sometimes involve regulatory matters affecting the entire energy sector, I think this might cause me at least a little bit of consternation. I do know that he says he no longer holds this particular position or asset or whatever it might be, but I think I'd flag this for further inquiry, because there appears to be at least a sort of tangential nexus to our work.
And I think that's really the critical factor here, because at the end of the day, if this company is either involved in matters that our agency engages in, which is to say that they'll either be a company that's investigated by our people, or they're subject to our regulations, we clearly want to flag this as a potential conflict, because even if this person no longer holds, if this is an employment position, and it looks like it might be because we've got a 401k below it, and that is kind of a clue to what this first entry probably is. So this is probably a prior employment thing. Even if he no longer holds it, we still have concerns about the fact that he's coming in from this entity, and he's got some vestigial vestigial sense of loyalty and whatever to the organization. Now, from a legal technical standpoint, the ethics official sitting out there saying, oh yes, he has a covered relationship, and so that would be an impartiality concern. From a supervisory standpoint, a supervisor doing that review, you don't have to know that it would be a 502 as opposed to a 208. The biggest thing,
you just have to tell us that big private energy company is someone that's affected by our work, or is somehow involved in our work. So therefore, someone needs to look at this.
Exactly. And then you also have to be aware, for purposes of assigning anything to this person, that this is potentially a problem for them.
That's right.
Okay. So if we look at the next entry, we got 401k from big private energy company.
And I think, this is an area where the technical review can be very well informed by our conflicts review.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, just sort of in my own familiarity with 401ks and similar plans, that you can buy stuff inside of those.
Yes.
You can hold things in your 401k.
Right.
And I don't see any of those things reported here.
Right.
So I see the name of the container, but I don't see the names of the contents of the container.
Right.
So it seemed to me that I can't make any determinations about possible conflicts with assets held within the container of the 401k. So I think I probably need more information. And I think because it's a 401k from an energy company that we think might do business with our agency, I'd like that information sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Because there might be some preferred mechanism for employees to own company stock in the 401k. That's a common thing.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, yes, maybe a technical deficiency, but it's creating a substantive deficiency for us in that we can't determine if there's a potential conflict, and the nature of the asset provides a particular concern because it's with the company that's affected by our work.
Right. And this is one place where I do think that if supervisors are going to do review of these forms, that they do have to have enough sensibility about identifying, for example, that a 401k is something that should have holdings.
Right.
And that it's the holdings that they need to know in order to determine if there's a problem. And that's not to say that the supervisor has to be the one to go back and get that information. That might be something, again, that this just gets flagged and passed on to the ethics shop. But at the end of the day, I think it's worthwhile, making sure the supervisors have enough on the ball to know, I don't have enough information here to be able to say this is strictly okay.
Yep. And I think, another thing is employees go to their supervisors when they have questions.
Right.
So it's not impossible that Mr. Nikolic would come to his supervisor as a new filer and say, do you know if I have to put this on the form? And if the supervisors are aware of the requirement to report those things and the purpose for disclosing them,
Mm-hmm.
That's a question they might be able to triage and save us some time.
Exactly. Okay, so the next one is, or actually the next two, we can just sort of take the next two because they're both honoraria. One is for the Society for Nuclear Research, and the other is the Council on Atomic Energy.
Yes, I think as a supervisor, my first question is, are these societies or councils that communicate with our office?
Mm-hmm.
Do they have policy positions that they advance that they hope we implement through regulation? Do we send people to these organizations for training or for other purposes?
Mm-hmm.
Do they do business with us?
Mm-hmm.
And given the nature of our work at the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission and the names of these organizations, I think I'd assume that there's at least a possible nexus here.
Mm-hmm.
And as a supervisor, I'm not sure what kind of conflict an honoraria presents,
Mm-hmm.
But it's something that I'd like the ethics official to maybe inquire with Mr. Nikolic about.
Mm-hmm.
And also that it might be suggestive of some sort of outside activity or arrangement that we want to think about. Is this part of his participation in the Speakers Bureau? Is he a university teacher?
Right.
Is there more to this story? So I think I just said that this feels close to our work. Maybe we're familiar with these organizations and we should take a look at it.
Exactly. And so again, what the supervisor is bringing to the table is the piece of information that has to do with where, if at all, are we likely to officially encounter this organization in the business of the work that we're doing for our agency. And I think another piece here, and this kind of gets more to the management piece for supervisors, is that, depending upon what sensibilities are about professional engagement in outside organizations and outside, entities, the supervisor knowing that this person comes in with these affiliations or with these types of, there might be some expectations that need to be addressed. There might be some continuation of participation issues that need to be addressed. So this could be, sort of pointing to some larger, managerial issues that not specifically just a conflicts issue.
We have a question coming in, Cheryl, from Lisa Fairhall. And she asks, does an employee whose spouse is an architect or attorney need to disclose the names of the spouse's clients?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that they do. I don't think that you have to identify the actual clients' names on the form.
No, this is actually a really good question where I think our sort of metric or our heuristic
Mm-hmm.
For review is really good. Because in my experience, where employees have spouses that have clients,
Mm-hmm.
you'll get the name of the employee's spouse's employer.
Right.
I work for Jones Day, or I work for such and such firm.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the nature of the work in your agency, it may be necessary to find out what kind of work the spouse does
Right.
in order to do a complete conflicts analysis,
Mm-hmm.
even if that's not reportable on the form. So I think this is a clue that in some cases you may need more information. At the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission, we may not, unless we think the spouse is working for a firm that does energy law. But where you had a nexus between the firm and the agency, there may be a need for more information, even if it's not reportable.
I think so, and I there may be a question about whether and to what extent you can require the employee, even informally, to identify all of the spouse's clients. That I don't know, and I can't answer that question. But what I can say is this, though. I think that notwithstanding, if there's any question in anybody's mind about whether or not the nature of this spouse's business that he or she is engaged in where there's a real potential that they could have clients that could create a conflict or an impartiality concern for the employee, that the employee has to be put on notice that to the extent that you know who your spouse's clients are,
Right.
you have ethics restrictions with respect to those people. So even if they don't have to affirmatively disclose them on a form or to an ethics official, they're still on the hook for it. So it's not they get out of jail free just because they don't have to disclose it on the form.
So we have a counseling obligation.
Right.
Right. We need to make sure the employee understands the ethics implications of his or her spouse's employment. But likewise, we can attack this from the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
When an employee is assigned to a new matter, we can confirm that the spouse isn't representing people on that matter. That
Right.
would be a very bad situation for us. If we have an employee who's involved in litigation or other kinds of legal work, it would be really bad for the employee to show up and have his or her spouse standing there as opposing counsel.
Exactly.
So we'd want to make sure to counsel employees to that effect. And also, if there are sort of regulatory investigatory matters, to sort of confirm that there's not a professional relationship there that could pose us a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an excellent question.
That was
Thanks,
an excellent
Lisa.
question. Okay, so the next thing on the list is Seagate Technologies. And this is one where, I didn't know what Seagate Technologies was.
Me neither.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just because you can't identify it, like you don't know it immediately or it doesn't jump off the page at you, I would still argue that a supervisory review, if you're unfamiliar with an entry, you need to look it up,
Or just note that you've never heard of them.
Yeah, or you've never had any business with them or whatever.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't hurt you to look them up either, because
No.
just to know whether or not they have some relatedness to the work that's being done. Because even if they aren't currently someone who you've dealt with, doesn't mean they could never be.
Right.
And it's sometimes useful for people to know, oh, well, this is at least an entity that is in the range of the work that we do.
And I think this is an area where the communication between the supervisor and the reviewing ethics official is important.
Mm-hmm.
Right. As long as the supervisor is clear with what they have and haven't done,
Mm-hmm.
The ethics official can support any gaps. But it's important for the ethics official to understand what that is. So if the extent of the supervisor's review is to say, to my knowledge, we've not done business with or affected Seagate,
Mm-hmm.
and also I have no idea who Seagate is,
Mm-hmm.
that's fine as long as that's communicated to the ethics official, because then they can look and see, is this someone who might come before our agency in some conceivable universe,
Right.
or I need to look into this,
Right.
Versus the supervisor determining that this is something that could never pose a problem. We
Right.
need to communicate the difference between those two conclusions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the reason why I would encourage supervisors to look it up, because if you can eliminate it without any question, if you can say this is an organization, for example, Seagate Technologies does data storage for computers.
Yep.
So
They make big hard drives.
yeah, so
Who knows if that's a problem?
Who knows if that's a problem? But if the supervisor can say, "Oh, heck no, this would never ever be something for us," then at least it's one fewer thing that the ethics shop has to deal with, and it's
Right.
it's not a question mark that's hanging out there.
And I think that's particularly true if you have a report where there's only like one or two things that pose a sort of question mark,
Mm-hmm.
and you can sort of clear the whole report with a little bit of due diligence.
Right.
That can save everyone a lot of time, because you don't want to get the phone call from the ethics official where you have to talk this through again.
Right.
So it may just be more efficient that way.
Right. Okay. Okay, let me get on. You got it? Oh, there we go. Okay. So our next entry is Transocean. And that's offshore drilling. That's a Swiss-based offshore drilling company.
Yeah, so I think this would be a factual question for the supervisor. Right. Do the spillover effects of our regulations affect drilling companies?
Mm-hmm.
Or, do you think there's a nexus there? And this might be another place where the employee or the supervisor is unfamiliar with the company.
Right.
You just don't know who they are. So you could either look it up or note that you don't know what it is and ask the ethics official to come back to you.
I don't think it's necessarily important that the supervisor be able to identify what an ADR is. Do you, Patrick?
Not at all.
Okay. So that's more for the ethics shop to deal with what the nature of the financial interest is. I think it's enough for the supervisor to flag that it is or isn't a potential problem.
Right.
The next one we have is fidelity managed account.
And so these are tricky. And this is another place where if we go back to our heuristic and ask ourselves, do we have enough information here to determine that, yes, this is definitely a potential conflict of interest. No, this will never pose a conflict. If we can't answer in one of those cases, we are going to have to use the third option, which is we need more information.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of the managed account, we're going to need more information. Mm-hmm. We don't know what's inside of the account. We don't know if it holds securities, mutual funds, or cash. We just have no idea. Mm-hmm. So one way or the other, the filer is going to have to provide that information with us so that we can determine whether or not we're going to have a potential issue. And that could be something you just flag for the ethics official, mm-hmm. say this entry doesn't provide me enough information to determine one way or the other, and they can follow up, or you could kick it back to the employee and ask them for that information directly.
Mm-hmm. The next one is iShares S&P Global Telecom. And this looks like it's probably some sort of a sector kind of.
Looks like a sector fund.
Looks like a sector fund. And so again, I would look at the title of it, and if as a supervisor, I would say it looks like it's a telecom. If it's a telecom, I don't think it's a problem, and and basically make that statement and move on.
So this is an example of something where you could probably say, our work doesn't affect telecom companies. It's reportable, but I don't think it's an issue.
Right.
Yeah.
And basically then the same for Smith Hardware. If you look Smith Hardware up, again, it's a matter of, is it related to the duties of the position? Is it anybody that we have to work with? Again, flag it.
Yep.
If it is, and say if it's not. And 529 plans.
529 plans generally, they're not going to be an issue. In some cases, there may be assets disclosed. An ethics official the first time might go back to determine what kind of 529 plan, but as a supervisor, you can probably look at this and say, it's a 529 plan. It's probably not going to be an issue, and if the ethics official feels the need to look it up, then they might do so. If you're getting this for the very first time, like in the case of Mr. Nikolic, mm-hmm. it might be helpful to have the name of the state, mm-hmm. Because offerings differ between the states for the 529 plans. That would be a complete way of disclosing. But again, if we're just looking for the nexus, us at the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission, this might be something that you sort of pass along.
Right. So common entries that you're going to see on part one, just to kind of as general alert you to, that you would expect to see, particularly on a new entrant, is anything from a prior employer. And whenever you have an employment interest, one of the things that you're going to want to follow up on, and actually I meant to point that out when we were on the spousal employment, is whenever you see an employment interest, you really should probably inquire as to whether or not there's a retirement or a pension interest, because most employers do offer some form of retirement or pension plan. And just be looking for investment interests, looking for severance or other payments from a prior employer. For your employees, any outside earned income. So that's a clue as to whether or not they're engaged in outside employment. And then obviously securities and sector funds. Those are typically the things you're going to see on a part one entry.
And we have a question in from Marigold Henderson about part one. She says that IT staff may have stock in Microsoft, HP, or other companies that government agencies do business with for purchase of computers, etc. These same IT personnel may be involved in bidding or recommending a product or company. How should that be analyzed? Mm-hmm. And that strikes me as a really straightforward nexus.
Yes.
That's if we were looking at a new entrant report for a member of the IT staff, and they have significant holdings in the IT sector or any holdings in the IT sector, we'd want to take a really close look at those and make sure that either an exemption applies, a remedy is put in place, mm-hmm. or that those assets are divested.
Right.
So, that's exactly the kind of nexus that we'd like supervisors to help us look for.
Exactly. And so it might be that different IT staff have different functions, and that there's certain ones that are not going to be involved in matters that would affect necessarily the hardware providers, as opposed to software providers, as opposed to data cloud people, as opposed to, but that's for a supervisor to help sort through. But anytime I would see, if I was looking at an IT staff person's form and there was anything on there that was IT, information technology related, I would flag it and it would have to be resolved.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thanks for the question, Marigold.
Okay, so the next. So this person doesn't list any liabilities, but they do have some outside positions. So the first one, he's clarified for us that indeed the big private energy company was in fact an energy company, and he actually did hold a position with them as vice president.
We've sort of dealt with that already.
We have dealt with that already.
That's going to be an issue where the ethics official is going to look into any residual relationships and determine what kind of issue that we have.
And the ethics official at that point might also want to inquire as to whether or not there are any other things that the person is getting from them. Because if they were a vice president, then maybe they have other ties, economic ties to the company, either like a severance package that they got, or because the higher up in an organization that someone is, the more likely that they're going to have things over and above just a retirement from the organization. But again, I would relegate that to the ethics office to do the sort of follow-up behind. I wouldn't expect a supervisor necessarily to flag those things.
We just need to flag the nexus.
We need to flag the nexus.
The nature of the conflict or appearance issue is the ethics official's sort of legal analysis to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same with the next two, which is Scientists for Nuclear Tomorrow, where this person is engaging in research as a member of a research group, and Concerned Citizens for a Clean Nuclear Energy, which is a public advocacy group. What are your thoughts on these, Patrick?
So here, just sort of facially, it looks like there's a nexus between our work and some of the advocacy work that might be happening here. So I think I'd want to flag that and say, I think this is something that we should look into. Obviously, if our agency has a prior approval requirement, there is going to be a robust analysis that's going to take place. But that's something that I would just flag for the ethics official to initiate, and expect that they would involve me as a supervisor where necessary in that process.
And particularly if the supervisor has an opinion about, or has some concerns or questions about the nature of the employee's participation. I think particularly like with a public advocacy group, I mean, there might be other issues beyond even just ethics issues that would need to be discussed, and that might be something that the supervisor wants to discuss with the ethics shop.
That's right.
But at least this way the supervisor is armed with this information and can bring that sensibility to the table. So again, with common entries, you're going to see on part 3, if it's a new entrant, you would expect to see the prior employer. You're going to want to look for any outside employment, which can include consulting. And if you've got consulting, then, that's income that the person is deriving. And any employee-owned businesses, that would be something you might expect to see on this report. And that brings its own concerns, and employee-owned business and other ethics issues besides just 208 and 502. And I think particularly there, that would be a good, if you see anybody who has an employee-owned business, that's a really good opportunity for the supervisor to really bolster the notion that you do not conduct your personal business during government time on government property. So really put the employee on notice that, I'm aware that you have this business, and I do not want to see any of it being conducted, in the workplace on government time, you know. And then there are certain outside activities that are likely to be revealed here as well, although not all outside activities are going to be reported on part 3. Okay. And then finally, we have under part 4, which are agreements and arrangements. He's indicated that he's going to continue to participate in the defined contribution plan. So that's just affirming for us that it is a defined contribution plan and he does participate in it.
And our analysis will be the same.
And our analysis would be the same here. Yes.
Someone's going to have to follow up and find out what's in it.
So if we go to the next slide. So what you're typically going to see on Part 4, and if you should be looking for, are retirement and other benefits from primary employers. And this should be there even if someone's like an annual filer, because if they're continuing to participate in a retirement or other sort of benefit from a prior employer, that's going to continue to be on every report while they remain, sort of invested in that retirement plan. Leaves of absence. So if you have people are coming in from universities and they're on a leave of absence should be reported on that part of the form. And then any agreements that people have for outside employment, and that's going to include agreements to teach, speak, or write for compensation. So, if people are engaging in outside employment, if they're in the throes of doing that, you should see that on Part 4. And that's our presentation piece for today. So now we'd like to open up the phone lines for questions. And also if anyone has any questions on the Hangout, we'd be happy to entertain them at this point.
Thank you. At this time, if we have anyone on the telephone lines wishing to ask a question or make a comment, please press star followed by 1 on the keypad of your telephone. And please be sure that your phone is unmuted and clearly record your name at the prompt so your question may be introduced. Once again, if we have anyone wishing to ask a question or make a comment, please press star followed by 1 and record your name at the prompt.
And if anyone on the Hangout would like to ask a question, you can type your question into the question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Well, we give folks some time to think of any questions they might have or get through the phone system. I think to sort of recap, the thing we need from the supervisors most is the knowledge they have about the work that they do. Mm-hmm. And the question they really need to ask themselves is, when I'm looking at an individual asset or a reported holding or a reported position, can I determine that this is likely to come before us or be affected by our work or not? Mm-hmm. And to share that information with the ethics official.
Absolutely. And I think one of the benefits of having supervisory participation in this is, again, it gives them, I think, a better sensibility about how the ethics rules really do support the mission of the agency. Right. It gives them, first of all, ownership over helping to protect the integrity of the programs for which they have cognizance and they're responsible That's for. Right. But it allows them to really see in a very practical way how their role as supervisors includes being responsible for protecting their own programs and operations.
Right. So this is another example of managers using their discretion and knowledge to protect the integrity of their programs. And it's certainly not the only one. So this in some way should be familiar. Mm-hmm. I'm not showing any questions on the Hangout.
We do have one question from the audio.
Okay. Oh, great.
Chris, your line is open.
Hi. In lieu of supervisory review,
mm-hmm. Yes.
If an ethics official thinks that there might be a conflict on a report,
right.
What are your thoughts on the ethics official simply going straight to the employee and saying, hey, you reported these 3 stocks. Do you do anything that could impact these companies' financial interests?
I think, certainly the employee can provide, valuable information to us about the nature of his or her work. Mm-hmm. If you don't use supervisory intermediate review, that's certainly a resource that you can avail yourself of. Where you find that there's a potential problem, you may need to enlist the supervisor mm-hmm. to assist with remedial actions. For example, not directing work to the employee that could pose a potential problem. Mm-hmm. Also, sometimes an employee isn't in the best position to know what work may or may not be assigned to him or her.
Right.
So, depending on the position of the employee, they can be very, very helpful. With some other employees, it may be necessary to get a broader reading of their likely assignments.
Mm-hmm. No, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with you going to the employee and saying, I see these, these interests are reported on your report, and in order to determine whether or not you have a conflict, I need to know, are there, not only are you currently working on any matters that could affect these entities, but are you likely to be assigned any matters that could affect these entities? And again, as Patrick suggested, they might be able to answer the first piece, and maybe they can't answer the second piece. And if they can't, then that might be bumping it up to the supervisor and asking the supervisor.
Okay. That's a great question. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. And once again, if we have anyone wishing to ask a question or make a comment, please press star followed by 1 and record your name at this time. One moment.
And again, I think one of the things we did try to emphasize in this broadcast is that, you know, the supervisor's role in it doesn't have to be this formal, almost like a pseudo ethics official review of the form, and their understanding of all of the you know, regulatory and legal requirements does not have to be particularly, sort of expert, or, you know, for them to be able to provide meaningful value added sort of participation in that whole process.
And I think that the timing of the review is something that's not specifically prescribed. So if supervisors would prefer to refer to the 450s before making assignments throughout the year, that is another way that you can manage conflicts. Because I know with certain kinds of work that employees do, it's very difficult to project what kind of work might be assigned to them.
Exactly.
Say, for example, you have employees who are involved in legal work, where they might be prosecuting claims against anyone, or involved in litigation with kind of anyone in the country. It may be more useful to conduct the conflicts review at the time an assignment of a matter is going to be made.
Exactly.
So that's another opportunity that you can use to involve the supervisor in the review process.
And I think it's one of the mistakes that we all kind of make, and that is that, you know, the 450 is just a snapshot. I mean, it's a snapshot in time, and it's a reflection of holdings as of a certain date. And I mean, I think both the employee needs to know this. I think supervisors need to know this. And I think even as ethics officials, we have to constantly remind ourselves that a conflict of interest analysis is an ongoing requirement, because as work changes, the prospect for conflict changes. As financial holdings change, as your spouse gets new employment, as all of those sorts of things change, this is a constant sort of dynamic thing that's going on, and it's not a static thing. And so there do have to be reevaluations, you know, constantly about whether or not, you know, currently do I face the prospect for a conflict of interest.
Right. And I'm aware of a number of agencies who have employees who are investigators. Prior to assigning someone to an investigation, they will confirm that there is not a new financial interest that would pose a potential conflict, or that there wasn't one already reported. So, you know, that's a perfectly legitimate approach to take to managing conflict. And I think we might have time for just one more question. Do we have any questions on the phone, Emily?
I'm showing no questions at this time.
Okay.
And we're not seeing any on the Hangout. But thanks very much, Cheryl, for joining us.
Thanks, Patrick, very much.
And thank all of you for joining us.
Yes.
And if you found this to be useful, you know, we encourage you to share the link with your supervisor. The recording will be available immediately after the close of the broadcast, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So thanks very much.